Welcome to Windows on the World. Interesting show for you tonight. Harm and heresy. We're going to be looking at modern day heresy as defined by the online harms bill and more, plus the Reformation and the instigation of heresy by the Roman Church. And I think these comparisons are very apt today because the modern heretic could well be you or me. Heretic, from the Greek heretikos, meaning choice or to choose, heresy. Well, if you make the wrong choice, you are punished. When Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon wrote Against All Heresies, said to be sometime around 180 AD, heresy was stated to be in the beliefs of the Gnostics. This was a broad church of apocalyptic writing, but outside the Roman definition. As an early Catholic, Irenaeus described heretics as bringers of alien doctrines to the altar of God. He did not meter out any punishment as being a believer in God. He believed it to be God's will whether those he considered heretics were punished or not. Seems pretty fair under the circumstances. In other words, he put the law into God's hands. A fair and equitable way to express his belief, which he, of course, was fully entitled to. It was Tertullian in 200 AD who laid down the law of man. He was a lawyer and legal raconteur and came up with his prescription against heretics. Any questioning of his interpretation of the faith would be itself a heresy. Bible quotes were later used to justify the man-made rules which followed. It was actually St. Paul that said the heretic is self-condemned in the respect that one chooses for oneself one's own actions. Well, we could interpret this to mean that when one chooses a wrong path, one will at some point suffer the consequences. You know what will happen if you do that, don't you? Okay, it's your choice, but I wouldn't, etc. The point here is that Paul was shunning those who he believed were non-believers. Everyone is entitled to do this. It is called free will. When I warned countless people that their actions were going to get them into trouble, it became clear that most will continue on that path and have to learn the hard way. Such is the way of free will, though, and the stubbornness of the human condition. Never has this been more apparent, of course, than over the last several years. Over this time, new heresy laws have appeared. The most draconian and travesty of all existing law being the online harms bill. The reason it's a travesty of all existing law is it is not based on any legal definition. Though apparently watered down slightly, it puts the definition of what harm may be in the hands of a corporate entity, in this case Ofcom, and their stakeholders. An entirely untrustworthy and political series of organisations, in my opinion, and that opinion is actually based on some experience. The guidance for MPs, which was recently put forward by Penny Mordaunt in the UK Parliament, is an insult to the intelligence of everyone, it being the product of special interest lobbying groups on what MPs are allowed or not allowed to believe. This is actually no different from the heresy laws, except that these new laws are not even argued to be in Scripture, just advisory but enforced through statute. Of course, we have these online harms laws in pretty much every country now. All the big countries and, of course, all the Crown territories first, as that is always the way. Well, the fact that a nobody lobbying group with allowed political power can dictate what is and isn't acceptable to talk about is in itself proof of the end of what was called democracy. Let's get back to early Christianity. Constantine absorbed Christianity into Rome in 313 AD, and by 325 AD had reinvented the early Christianity, inventing a new place for its origin and very near Constantinople, which was convenient for him. It is essential to remember, though, that Christianity is pre-Roman, something which has been forgotten by most today. The Catholic Church is used as a measure for Christianity. This is a very wrong assumption. The persecuted Gnostics of the Languedoc were, it seems, a mixture of beliefs. Valentinian Gnosis and its apocalypse and redemption actually resonates today as the archons or rulers are in the present polluting the information field and are comparable to demonic forces described in such works. It is likely that the gnosis of the Languedoc was polluted with the Kabbalah and the placing of man alongside God through illumination. The problem here being that the Catholic Church was defining them as heretics. The idea that we do not receive inspiration from a higher source but ourselves is the God as man world of the Kabbalists, the inhabitants of the Languedoc, along with the Cathars in the 1200s, so these two could well have crossed over. Well, the wars against the Cathars were known as the Albigensian Crusade, and from 1174 also defined as heresy. The Cathars were defined as heretics. The wars against the Cathars, known as the Albigensian Crusade, also defined heresy. However, Catholicism was never fully Christian and incorporated the pagan beliefs of Persian Mithraism, and the Cathars actually had a system which was simple but popular, so was seen to be heretic, especially in their rejection of Catholic doctrine. The state as church was established officially in the Edict of Thessalonica in AD 380, and those absorbed in the new church of Constantine were not at all happy when in 385 AD under Magnus Maximus that the first executions for heresy took place. A Spanish bishop and 4 of his supporters were executed. The later St. Martin of Tours and St. Ambrose of Milan were said to be horrified at this new development. So it was not popular. This idea of heresy was developed and the Bible verse was used out of context to justify it, such as Jesus talking about the division of the sheep and the goats, and according to Matthew, Jesus stating that this would lead to everlasting pain. I'm not going to read out the whole passage, but those who know the Bible will know what I'm talking about, and those who don't can look it up. The misinterpretation to suit the interpreter became common, even becoming absurd during the Reformation, but always enforced as mainstream dogma and belief. So the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which, along with the Eucharist being the flesh and blood of Jesus through bread and wine administered by a priest, stated anyone holding beliefs which were not supported by the Holy Roman Church should be turned in by their neighbours. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 stated that heretics did write books and did wickedly instruct and inform people, and that they should be wiped off the face of the earth, literally. I'll give you a few quotes from that. We excommunicate and anathematize every heresy raising itself up against this holy, orthodox and Catholic faith which we have expounded above. We condemn all heretics, whatever names they may go under. They have different faces indeed, but their tails are tied together insomuch as they are alike in their pride. Now this was very typical of the Catholic Church, to describe heretics as being full of pride and pompousness, which actually they weren't in the main, because they were really following the Christian principles rather than the Catholic dogma. It says, let those be condemned, handed over to the secular authorities. Now this really was a way of the church washing his hands of them and saying, you can execute them for us. Basically, or presented to their bailiffs for due punishment. Clerics are first to be degraded from their orders, so there was a lot of priests who were described as heretical, especially during the Reformation. Mainly Protestant, but some Catholic priests also. And strangely, we're not talking about choose your side here, because at one point Catholics and Protestants were actually burnt together. Catholic priests actually were present at the burnings of reformists, all being burned together. The goods of the condemned are to be confiscated if they are laypersons, and if clerics they are to be applied to the churches from which they received their stipends. Those who are only found suspect of heresy are to be struck with the sword of anathema, unless they prove their innocence by an appropriate purgation, having regard to the reasons for suspicion and the character of the person. Let such persons be avoided by all until they have made adequate satisfaction. If they persist in the excommunication for a year, they are to be condemned as heretics, and the secular authorities will deal with them. It goes on and on. Insofar as they can, this is the Catholic Church, to expel from the lands subject to their jurisdiction all heretics designated by the Church in good faith. It also stated, if any bishop is negligent or remiss in cleansing his diocese of the ferment of heresy, then when this shows itself by unmistakable signs, he shall be deposed from his office as bishop, and there shall be put in his place a suitable person who both wishes and is able to overthrow the evil of heresy. So the wording of the Roman Church in regard to heresy is interesting, as it is plainly anti-Christian. It only allows for the admission and rejection of the unorthodox belief. Those that differed from what the Church defined as normal life, it says, later should be reported to the bishop. The responsibility, of course, was to put onto the bishop this responsibility to address the issue and bring punishment and therefore cleansing his diocese of heresy. And if he was found to have let someone off or not issued suitable punishment, then he would be replaced. Well, this is the same as today's communitarian law, and where you can be basically deplatformed or just left alone and persecuted by the consensus. Yes, it is the same as today's communitarian law, where there can be no rights without responsibilities, and it is your duty to snitch on your neighbour. And this, of course, was tested out during the COVID era. In current law, you can be assumed to have done something, and you have to prove that you didn't do it, which is an almost impossible task in most cases as defined today. This communitarian law is how the courts of the UK now operate. So you can find an article called UK Courts Communitarian Law at windowsontheworld.net, and I've got many examples of this because I've seen it happen in county court to Crown Court, and at Crown Court it's much more scary because we're getting into common law offences which are defined, and then the person has to prove themselves innocent because they are considered to be guilty. Now, people will say, well, it's always been like that. It hasn't. This is more like Napoleonic law. You're guilty until proved innocent, until you can prove yourself innocent. And in many cases, it's impossible to do. We only have to look at the Lucy Letby case. Anyone who's looked at any of the general details of that case can see that it is a travesty of justice, and it has been brought without any real foundation evidence. And what we have to remember, of course, in communitarian law, only guilty people are accused. Think about that. Therefore, to be a witness for an accused person puts the witness down as a potential criminal who can have their testimony removed, destroyed, or even find themselves accused. It actually happened to me as a witness, a defence witness. They don't like defence witnesses. The CPS will not help you or assist you in any way because they are the Crown Prosecution Service. And when it comes to the police, you can openly see the corruption and they can openly be corrupt. And there's nothing you can do about it, or so they think. There is no difference in today's deplatforming. The laymen are coerced into attacking those the global mafia don't want the public to hear from. This brings forth an old legal term, which I actually quite like, the negative averment, where you can state that there is no evidence that something did not happen or that something was not done, and it is believed that no evidence exists to prove otherwise unless it is presented. That's called playing them at their own game. And it's a useful tool which I've used in the past. I used it very successfully against a bailiff company called JBW Group, who threatened to take me to the High Court. However, my article, which came up under theirs in a Google search, this was before Google had actually changed into Internet 2, which is what we're in now, I believe, because you can't find things on there anymore. Well, my article came up under theirs. They were absolutely furious. I cost them an awful lot of money, and I was reliably informed that there was nothing they could do about it. So, stuck to my guns, and they backed off. I sent them a 40-page affidavit in the negative averment, and the barrister, who was a friend of mine, said this is going to cost them at least 10 grand to even get a look at. And they were using a big city law firm. In fact, they were using City Law Firm. So I never heard from them again. So let's now go on to the Online Harms Bill. And we're going to be talking about this because it actually defines people as modern day heretics. And all this through certain allowed lobbying groups and really on the back of Ofcom and stakeholders. So we're going to be getting into this in the second part of the show. First of all, I'll have a very short break. Welcome back. Just a few announcements. Our film, which is a series of interviews with Wayne Fontana, called Funny Old World, is now available to download on the homepage at windowsontheworld.net, along with our other films, Jet Harris, the definitive documentary. If you like early 60s music and Soho in the early 60s, the coffee bars, etc., the Shadows, and the pre-Beatles era, and of course after the Beatles era, because Jet only died in 2010, then I think you might enjoy that film. It's the definitive documentary of a real rock and roll rebel, not the fake ones we have today. And it's warts and all, which is the best way to be, reality. You can also download, of course, the Heretics of London, the Smithfield Martyrs, if you haven't done that. And do consider supporting the show. We get very little support and we are marginalised by all media. If you'd like to do that, join the £5 a month club. It only costs you £5 a month, and look what you get, access to everything for nothing. And of course, our shows and our regular broadcasts. One more thing. On Tuesday, I will be doing a tribute to one of the actors in the Heretics of London, the Smithfield Martyrs, namely the actor Des Britton, who actually passed away recently and played Friar John Forrest, who was burnt atop a statue of the Welsh warrior god Derfel Gadorn in Smithfield in 1538. And on this live stream, which is on Tuesday at 8 p.m. on YouTube, obviously then going to Odyssey, I will be going into some detail about this remarkable story and the way that the paganism of Derfel Gadorn, the Welsh warrior god, was laid upon Friar John Forrest, who was a Franciscan monk. If it sounds absurd, well, it is, but that was the whole way that things evolved and the arguments were formed during this era of the Reformation, when one year you could be burnt for heresy, but next year you would be fine. This happened, of course, to Anne Askew, and she was detained under the Act of 6 Articles and being in breach of the advancement of true religion. Both of these were actually renounced, taken down, and never heard of again a year after she was burnt at the stake. So it really depended on who was saying what at the time. I'm going to give you an example now, which is one of the most unlucky stories of this era. One of Michael Servetus, who was burnt at the stake in Geneva on October the 27th, 1553, and he was the first European to correctly describe the function of pulmonary circulation. He was versed in many sciences, in mathematics, astronomy, meteorology, geography, human anatomy, medicine and pharmacology, as well as jurisprudence, translation, poetry, and the scholarly study of the Bible in its original languages. He was renowned in the history of several of these fields, particularly medicine. His work on the circulation of blood and his observations on pulmonary circulation were particularly important. He participated in the Protestant Reformation and later rejected the Trinity doctrine and mainstream Catholic Christology. After being condemned by Catholic authorities in France, he fled to Calvinist Geneva, where he was denounced by John Calvin himself and burned at the stake for heresy by order of the city's governing council. Such was the changing dogma of the times. Now, we're getting on to the subject which we'll be talking about in this show, which is the new heresy. But first of all, let's give you some more background. The Act of 6 Articles was also known as an act abolishing diversity in opinions and was brought in to statute in 1539. It made the monarch supreme and reinforced transubstantiation and brought the state and church together in one unified objective against heresy. And combining this with the earlier Statute Heretico Comburendo of 1401, which stated amongst other things that heretics should be burned for denying the wafer and wine administered at the altar when they said it was not the literal flesh and blood of Jesus. This was the main reason why people were burnt at the stake. Well, there was never any precedent for this in Christianity. It was actually an invention of the Roman Church. And, interestingly, the Talmud, which listed punishment in order. Thus, we had stoning, burning, beheading, and strangulation. Stoning and beheading were not originally Arabic either. They were originally Jewish, and the order of importance was changed in the Talmud and its Mishnah, which is the written version of the oral law, and the Gemara, which is the record of the rabbinic discussions following this being written down. Basically the musings of these rabbis. So, I just want to read you something that's really interesting. Professor Irene and Yael Rosenberg of the University of Houston Law Center have investigated the methods of execution prescribed in the Jewish scriptures for various crimes and the rationale behind these prescriptions, publishing their findings in Tulane Law Review in 2004 under the heading of God's Mercy and the 4 biblical methods of capital punishment: stoning, burning, beheading and strangulation. They included in their researches not only the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but also Jewish oral law known as the Talmud, the 2 parts which are the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah, compiled around the year 200 and onwards, generally states the law, while the Gemara, a much lengthier text compiled with some documentation by all these rabbis, is said to have originated about 3 centuries later, and it's a commentary on the law consisting largely of rabbinic debates, extremely tedious but very revealing. There is much discussion in the Mishnah and Gemara as to the most severe penalty and which should be attached to which crime. An anonymous Mishnah rule, which usually signifies a majority opinion, lists the penalties in descending order of severity as stoning, burning, beheading and strangulation. However, there was a dissent by Rabbi Shimon, who argued that the proper sequence is burning, stoning, strangulation and then beheading. In trying to determine whether burning was a more severe punishment than stoning or vice versa, the rabbinic discussions focused less on the relative physical torment involved than on the nature and seriousness of the crime for which the respective sentences were prescribed in the biblical texts. So, some of the rabbis would argue that stoning is the most severe because it is the punishment for blasphemy and idol worship, applicable to those who breach the most fundamental tenets of Judaism, while others would contend that burning is the most severe because it applies to the daughter of a priest who commits adultery, and that such an act profanes her father. Why is profaning her father a worse offence than profaning God? This is their rationale. Because God is not harmed by idolatrous acts or blasphemy, whereas the priest is injured by his daughter's promiscuity. So this is the nature of argument. And I found that extremely interesting because a lot of people do not know how Talmudic law has been so influential, even up to today. So, Rabbi Shimon brought in the law to include burning first, then stoning, followed by strangulation and beheading for those guilty of adultery. And his argument, as we've said, was that God may have been offended, but more damage was done to the man who was the victim of the adultery, as God was not directly affected. So the retribution was for the victim of the adultery. A drastic and unnecessary judgment in any circumstance, really. So, like now, the heresy laws were applied to mean that even those who prayed for heretics were guilty of heresy by association. Does that remind you of anything? Yes, you may have talked to somebody or shared somebody's tweet, and therefore you agree with everything they've ever said. This happened to me by a certain lobbying group, and it was both disturbing and hilarious. I did argue back, but of course you don't get an argument, you just get a lot of accusations and ridicule because there is no argument in the first place. So the modern day Pharisees and persecutors of today attack by stating you may have been seen with someone who they do not approve of, or even worse, have given them a platform by letting them speak. Hope Not Hate used this against me several times when I had the Israeli heretic I think it'd be okay with being called a heretic, Gilad Atzmon, on my show a few times, and we got into some really interesting stuff. And there was another case which was all about the bringing of private prosecutions outside the CPS, which is a very dangerous precedent. And I interviewed somebody on this, and I won't mention them because in actual fact all they were doing was enabling the law to be changed against what they were purportedly fighting for. This is the tactic, of course, of those instructing government on how they should react against those who commit such heresies. Let's go back now to heretic Anne Askew, who was accused of being in possession of a book by another heretic priest, John Frith, a lawyer. Also, Frith was burnt at the stake in Smithfield in 1533. Frith was captured smuggling Bibles back from Antwerp for William Tyndale, and when apprehended in Kent was actually offered an escape by the king's men who didn't want to detain him. Frith was such a likeable character, nobody wanted him to get into trouble. But Frith just cheerfully stated that he wanted to meet his accusers face to face, which was rather naive of him, but when you are up against non-argument, there is little you can do but be condemned and burnt to death. Frith had arrived in England in July 1531 to help distribute Tyndale's Bible. He was arrested as a vagabond in Reading and he was placed in the stocks, and according to John Fox in his Book of Martyrs, Frith was an honest man who found it very difficult to lie convincingly, so the authorities were fairly sure he wasn't a tramp despite his disguise, but they failed to make him reveal his identity. Until he could be identified, he was locked in the stocks at Reading without food. When he began to suffer badly from hunger, he asked that the local schoolmaster be brought to him. Well, as soon as the schoolmaster, Leonard Cox, arrived, Frith began to complain of his captivity in Latin. They talked of many things in both Latin and Greek, and then Cox hurried to the town judges and complained of the treatment being given to such an excellent, well-educated young man. Frith was actually freed from the stocks without further punishment. However, Frith was arrested when he was suspected that he might have been carrying stolen goods in his bag. When the bag was opened, they discovered that it contained English Bibles. The ones translated, of course, by Tyndale. After the authorities discovered his real name, he was sent to the Tower of London. While in the Tower, he wrote an extended essay where he explained his arguments against transubstantiation. It was smuggled out and read by his supporters, and he argued first that the matter of the sacrament was no necessary article of faith under pain of damnation. That's a pretty good argument. Next, that Christ had a natural body and could not be in two places at once. And third, that the "this is my body" quote they were using to take and eat the wafer as the body of Christ was not literal. Last, that what the church practiced was not what Christ instituted. Well, that was a rounded and sensible view, but one that got him burned alive in Smithfield in 1533. So the real death here was one of argument, the facing off of two contrary opinions and arriving at the most likely in the search for truth. Of course, when debate and argument ends, we get heresy, a choice. You either recant your heretical beliefs or you die. Of course, the arguments were all down to biblical interpretations, but it was denial of the presence of the flesh and blood of Christ in the Eucharist wafer, which was the stumbling block for the accused heretic. No matter how cleverly they argued around it, the heresy laws trapped them into, yes, choose your side. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. Well, Anne Askew, to get back to her, whilst being detained, was visited by a priest who warned her that the book that she was carrying, purported to be by John Frith, could get her burned as it had done him. However, when the priest actually read it, he could not find anything wrong within the book. One of Anne Askew's unpopular traits was that she was a young woman who knew the Bible and could argue successfully with trained clergy. She upset the clergy by stating that she would not trust the opinion of a priest just because he was a priest, and she had her own favoured priests which she quoted from, and these were the ones that she requested, which really wound up the priests that visited her when she was being interrogated. Interestingly, when asked something which may incriminate her, she would state, "How am I to know that, being a simple woman as I am?" Well, this infuriated her interrogators, as she'd moments before had the better of them over some complex theological issue which a simple, uneducated woman could never have known about. However, in the end, after a series of interrogations which went on a very long time, and after being illegally tortured twice in the Tower of London, she outright stated that "I deny the sacrament to be Christ's body and blood, as Christ is in heaven, and as for your God, it is but a piece of bread." She was immediately condemned, of course, but she had been condemned before being tortured, which was an entirely illegal act. Well, she'd done well up to this point, but like most heretics, when worn down by weeks of interrogation, they would snap and deny the Eucharist. Well, like today, the accusations of heresy often had a political undercurrent, and the knowledge that the heretic might be a bit too clever to be speaking in public. And this actually was very present in the case of the priest we're going to be talking about on Tuesday in the live stream, John Forrest. He was actually the only Catholic to be burnt at the stake, although many monks were actually hung, drawn and quartered. He was the only one to be burnt publicly in Smithfield, and his story, as I said, is fascinating, and it goes into his concocted relationship by Thomas Cranmer and others, with comparing him to this Welsh warrior god Derfel Gadon. We'll get more into that on the show. But if you want to see his story, you can find it in the Heretics of London, the Smithfield Martyrs, and download that from windowsontheworld.net. But like today, the accusations of heresy often had a political undercurrent, as they do now. And the knowledge that the heretic, of course, might be too clever, or in their terms, too big for their own boots. This happened, of course, during the witch hunts also, especially in Essex and Norfolk. Now, there were no more witches in Essex than anywhere else, but the lucrative theft of property from widows made sure the accusations were all investigated by the bounty hunter and witch finder Matthew Hopkins, and Essex and Norfolk were his manor, mainly Essex. Old women who may have made a few enemies in the village and had a nice house were particularly at risk of being accused of witchcraft. So now we get to modern day useful idiot groups like Antifa, and they're used in the same way as attack dogs of the imposed narrative. They are completely unaware of what they are actually against and those they are actually attacking, except in the use of prescribed sound bites, which they just use for name calling. They are used regularly, of course, for these modern-day witch hunts. For example, they hilariously call people fascists without knowing its historical meaning, its real aims. Well, the real aims of fascism, as defined by people such as Mussolini, were actually the opposite of the globalist agenda. Sovereignty of country, welfare of its people and culture against foreign invasion or by the state. This was, of course, always down to interpretation by the state itself. So that's a point that we cannot forget. But all this while the idiots of Antifa follow the path of the bloodthirsty funded revolutionary Bolsheviks. When using words as weapons, it is best to know the weapon, or it can sometimes hilariously backfire. Well, this can be seen in the meltdowns of those who have no argument apart from what they have repeated without any content. Energy and attention parasite, choose your side, time-wasting news outlets such as GB News function only for this charade and nothing else. That's all they do. Which brings us now to the modern-day heretic. One who has a contrary opinion, or even worse, a fact which is outside accepted dogma. The recent online harms bill, which has now gone through Parliament, with slight modifications. This is the new fourth lateral council. Heretics, they do write books, they do wickedly instruct and inform people. And to inform people is heresy. To be right is a heresy. It is at least far right to be right at all these days. The left and right came out of revolution. See our show on revolution. Choose your side and choose your fate. So, this modern day heresy, as defined by such lobbying groups who inform Parliament, the one that was proposed by Penny Mordaunt to be read by all MPs so that they do not get trapped into conspiracy theories, as we've said, was an insult to the intelligence of anyone with any brain whatsoever. There is no difference in modern day heresy than the heresy of yesteryear. However, there is no burning at the stake, which was, in the words of Heretico Corombendo, to strike such fear into people they would not dare go down a similar path. The definitions of harm now are so laughable that they should be taken deadly seriously. Well, for instance, in defamation, damages are awarded only after it is proved that there has been loss of reputation and income, and this is at the discretion of the judge as to how much is actually awarded. When lobbying groups are in charge of the definition of harm, it cannot get much worse. The Crimes Against the Persons Act defines the different types of physical harm, for instance. So say grievous bodily harm sounds serious, but in reality it is anything which breaks the skin. Can be a bruise or a cut, leading up to serious injury, leading to lifelong disfiguration. But it can be defined on a scale, and the seriousness is defined by the intent and whether it was premeditated. It's called mens rea, meaning the guilty mind. And of course, crimes of passion are taken into consideration. But in these new definitions of harm, there is no injured party, just a belief that someone may have been offended by something which someone may have said. Now, this goes right back to the days of the Reformation and characters such as Sir Richard Rich, a lawyer who was really a big part of the interrogation and persecution of heretics. And on the whims of things that Richard said that people had been accused of. In other words, Rich would say, well, there was a conversation between him and someone else, and he said this to someone else. just on this assumption that Rich had heard something. Somebody could be thrown into a jail or a coal house, as in the case of where Bishop Bonner actually interrogated his heretics. You'd be locked into some place, and you then had to work out what you were going to say in order to get out of it. And actually, this did happen to Friar John Forrest. He was the victim of a rumour mill type conspiracy within the Franciscan order itself. So not only was he going against the oath of supremacy and publicly attacking Henry VIII and arguing with him, but he was also being set up by people who he thought were his own brothers. So, when what happens in this case happens, the person accused of saying something can then be singled out by the press these days, and the created identity groups which exist only for this purpose, to destroy people's reputations, because that's what this is all about. Well, at least those who were burned at the stake were allowed to argue their case over long periods of time, and they could actually abjure, even though it was an embarrassing and degrading experience, and avoid being burned at the stake. The interesting thing being that they chose to burn at the stake because that was their choice. You can abjure and be humiliated and say that we're right, or you can say that we're wrong and you can burn to death. However, they were allowed to argue their cases, and this happened over long periods of time. For instance, the Anabaptist Joan Bocher was detained for over a year before she was burned at the stake. And the heretic could claim victory by becoming martyred, and the crowd were on their side. In this manifestation, the crowd are turned against the accused, and there is no argument or defence allowed. That is the difference with modern day heresy. You're not allowed to defend yourself. The consensus is that you are guilty, that you were seen with the wrong person, you said the wrong thing, therefore you must agree with everything that is labelled far right or against the current narrative. Bible translator John Rogers was ordered to be burnt at the stake when England became Catholic under Mary I, and he pulled the biggest crowd ever in Smithfield. And he was allowed, of course, to address the crowd, and he said, "O England, repent of your sins, beware of false antichrists, take heed they do not deceive you." He was actually offered a royal pardon minutes before the fires were lit, and he refused, willingly going to the flames and reportedly dying in a quick and dignified manner, making him a martyr and a hero of the people. And this was in front of his wife and 10 children, and he'd been denied any contact with them. And when he saw them in the crowd being dragged to Smithfield, after being degraded, of course, which meant that he would have been left in this dirty habit, and he would be dragged to Smithfield from Newgate in a terrible dishevelled state, just to make him more humiliated. Well, when he tried to speak to his wife and say goodbye to his children, he was beaten very ferociously by the Queen's henchmen. And the massive crowd roared at his last utterances. So the heretics could preach to the crowd before the wood was lit, and the crowds were on the side of the heretics, so much so that the burning of heretics was something of an own goal and needed hundreds of soldiers to control the crowds. Now, these days, you are just removed from the internet by a corporate entity and have all rights of response taken away. The Fourth Lateran Council had nothing on the present online harms bill because you are not even allowed to defend yourself. And this has become apparent over the past 10 years. I've attended places, and the Quakers were one of the worst hypocrites on the planet, because I was booked at the Quakers meeting house in Worthing, and because we were discussing the policies of anthropogenic global warming, we were deemed to be heretics, and my talk was cancelled within hours of it going ahead, which meant that the whole audience had to relocate to a nearby pub, which we did. This happened several times. Things are going to get a lot worse. So the modern day heretic does not even have the right to argue his or her case, and times have taken a turn for the worse, as if we thought that could be possible after the fires of the Reformation and the burning alive of people who merely had a different opinion to the state doctrine. So I hope you found that useful and interesting. Do keep in touch with us through the website. I do like to explore this theme of heresy because it is so relevant to what is going on at the moment. So yes, stay in touch with the website, info@windowsontheworld.net, and do join us for this Tuesday special when we will be going live and telling the story and the background and the implications of Friar John Forrest and the strange tale of Dervel Gaddon.